Welcome to a very special edition of Tim's Final Confessions. I'm Tim Durling. Thank you so much for tuning in. Joining me once again is author Martin Popoff. If you're watching this channel, you no doubt you've read some of Martin's books. You've got them. And if you're a Rush fan, you're way familiar with the trilogy of books that Martin has put out, starting with Anthem, Rush in the 70s, Limelight, Rush in the 80s, and the just released Driven, Rush in the 90s, and in the end. And this is mainly what we're going to be talking about today. So Martin, thank you for taking a little time out and talking to me here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Tim. Very cool.
So I've just literally finished reading Driven, third time through. I really wanted to get it up in here. First of all, and I know this is something that you work on. I love the look of these books. Like, they're very classy. They look good together as a set. I love the fact that there's blue, red, and gold. Like, it's just a really cool. They just look, and they look good on a shelf. So yeah, they're great books.
Yeah, they did a nice job of the design. I wasn't crazy about it to begin with because you couldn't see the foil and the the leather feel and all that stuff to it. And then once you get them out, you want to make sure the spines line up and everything's kind of in the same place. And even when you're going through the chapters in the book, so there was a lot of fooling around with that just to make sure everything lined up. Because how many CD reissue sets have we ever bought where one thing on the spine it doesn't match everything else, right? There's always a screw up. So yeah, I think they look pretty cool.
Speaking of CDs, just real quick, and because I only just noticed this last week, my Clockwork Angels CD, and my record is not like this. On the back, all of the song titles have a 0 length.
Yes, mine all do as well. And I can't remember. I'm pretty sure that was intentional. I don't know why. It's true. I don't know the story about that.
It's just strange because the vinyl has the actual lengths. But that was just something I mentioned that because that's obviously the final Rush album. So before we get into,
it wasn't intentional. Who knows, right? Maybe it was just a mistake.
We could have a collector's item. You never know. So before we get into Driven, I did have a couple things written down. Basically about not only the older books, but just the books in general. So was there anyone in doing the research for any of these books that you wanted to talk to, but you weren't able to talk to? The first person that comes to my mind is Peter Henderson. Did you try to get in touch with him or?
Right. Well, okay. So first off, because I already did Contents Under Pressure, and that was the first official Rush biography for ECW Press way long ago, I had all of those interviews, and this was going to be an expansion of that, using more or less a lot of the material, well, a couple of things. So using a lot of the interview material from, the whole story about what we didn't use in the movie, Beyond the Lighted Stage, plus what I wanted to do was also use Outside Press, which I didn't use in Contents Under Pressure. Plus, I was inspired to use a lot more kind of analysis and just inject kind of like descriptives in there from my own point of view by when I had to do that for the Led Zeppelin and the Clash books. So it had all of these elements all together. Now, having said that, I believe what happened there, so it wasn't really, I wasn't going to go get more people or look for more interviews than what we already had, because we had almost too much for 3 books to begin with, right? But Peter Henderson is an interesting one because I believe it wasn't particularly pursued to try get him for the movie, because Grace Under Pressure is kind of a skipped over album in the story, because you can only put so many story points in there. So it's funny, that was a little skipped over in the movie, and it's, I actually almost skip over that album when I think of Rush albums sometimes as well, even though it's one of my favorites. But yeah, I mean, there was more we could have pursued, but I literally couldn't even fit more. But that's the reason Banger, I believe, didn't pursue it.
Okay, so that makes sense. It's true too, because Grace Under Pressure is the only album where, well, let me put it this way. Pete Henderson's the only person that didn't work on at least 2 albums.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
They've got
So
all
in
those
the movie,
variants.
it does go right from not working with Terry Brown anymore to talking to Peter Collins. No, I was just wondering because we, Rush fans, you hear a lot about how, Steve Lillywhite was supposed to produce the album, and at the 11th hour, he bailed on them. So Pete Henderson, he was available and they got him. And they talked about how he was a great engineer, not so much on the production end and helping with songs. And that's one of the reasons. I believe that's the first Rush album that took two full years to come out, or at least almost. At the time, it was a long gap, and I kind of get the impression why. The only other thing that I picked up, and I think it's at the very beginning of Limelight where it kind of winds up. Rush fans, we read the liner notes, and inevitably you see the same names over again. You see Liam Burt, you see Howard Ungerleider, Terry Brown, Hugh Syme. You're just used to seeing all these names, and after a while, you kind of get to know the names of the road crew, Tony Gerenios, like you see the same names. But one name that it never occurred to me until I read the book that I stopped seeing at a certain point was Ian Grandy, who was a member of the road crew. And that stood out to me, the passage that was in, I think it's in Limelight, when he left the road crew, because he's like the only guy in the organization where there seemed to be some, I don't want to say sour grapes, but didn't leave on the best of terms. Whereas most of those guys, they were worked with them all the way through to the end, or if they did leave, there was no static to what did you get from talking to him about his overall impression of?
Definitely there was some sour grapes there. I mean, he intimated that I think he felt that it was a little bit his fault, and maybe he was a little quote unquote undisciplined, maybe some drug stuff going on. But I think he also sort of, it sounded like he rankled with Geddy a little bit, right? Or wrestled with Geddy, and Geddy was kind of like becoming the boss of the band and all this sort of stuff. But you're right, it totally stands out, because that's one of the things about this band is that they've just had this loyal throughput of people working for them, all the way through. And that little office in a bad part of town in Toronto, it's been there forever, right? And everybody who works there has been there forever. And you've got, Max Webster guys and Coney Hatch guys involved in the office and stuff, right? So there's just this. It is kind of a big family, but he's one of the ones that definitely, and it sounds a little bit also like there's a little undercurrent with Vic Wilson as well, the way things went down. But other than that, it seems to be a pretty good running machine of people who all kind of respect each other, right?
Yeah, the quote that I kind of was amused by, he said something, everybody's entitled to Geddy's opinion. So exactly, that did kind of make it sound like maybe Geddy was the one. And he was left out of, there was a group photo, I think, that appeared in one of the tour books. He was somehow omitted from it. And it wasn't a big part of the story. It was just something, it stood out because of the reasons you said. I mean, same manager, same art designer, same pretty much road crew, lighting, road manager, like all those things, probably booking agents. They weren't a band that you chew people up and spit them out. So that one really stood out as being, it stood out. So dealing with Driven itself, I've been kind of revisiting the post 90s Rush catalog to sort of prepare for this and kind of familiarize myself with them all over again. There were a lot of things that, as a longtime Rush fan, I was really surprised to read, or made me think of things that I hadn't thought of before. And you put it perfectly, like the leftover stuff from Beyond the Lighted Stage and Contents Under Pressure. There are passages in all of the books where I go, oh, I remember. Okay, I've read this before, but they're always expanded. They always go into much more detail. So there's familiar passages, but it's worth getting these 3 books to have them all filled in. Speaking of Roll the Bones, there's a couple things about Roll the Bones. One was a very interesting thing that I never thought of before, as you were talking to Rupert Hine, and it was about the song Roll the Bones and who was going to do the faux rap section in the middle of it. Because I remembered reading, they talked to John Cleese, of course, is the most famous name mentioned, but they'd also mentioned Robbie Robertson, somebody with a really deep voice. But But Rupert Hine brought up a really good point in that, what if it was a hit? What if they had this bizarre novelty hit out of nowhere? And it's like, now what do we do? And I never thought of that before, but it would almost be like the Rush version of Take Off that Geddy did with Bob and Doug McKenzie. I never thought of that before as being this blessing and curse, where this band that's established themselves as this integrity, and then they have this ridiculous song that John Cleese does a rap part in, and everybody remembers them just for that. That's just something that struck me about the role.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting, because that's exactly what happened. It kind of did turn out to be a novelty hit, and the novelty hit, and it's the album that reversed the fortunes from going a series of gold records into having a platinum record for the first time again, right? And then they're back down to gold, and then the last 3 albums don't even certify at all. That's one thing that's kind of interesting, because Rush had this thing going where everything went at least gold. So it's literally that idea of, even though it's bad press and they kind of get ribbed for the whole thing, it still turns out to be good press. And I would say 20% of those platinum sales was a little bit because of the ridiculous news story of that dumb rap, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because also, I never noticed, we talked about the cover. I've never thought to look for the reflection of the dice here. That's one advantage of rebuying the stuff on vinyl.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I recall correctly, it took almost 10 years, but it was eventually certified platinum, and it remains the last Rush album to be certified platinum, because you're right. Power Windows was the last one, I think, that was platinum. And from then on, it was steady gold albums, I think, all the way through Test for Echo, and maybe some of the newer albums certified in Canada. That's not as easy to research as it is the RIAA. And the other thing about the Roll the Bones era that I was kind of amused by, again, it was an expanded story, but it was when they played in, I believe it was Sacramento, when they played with Primus, and it was a general admission show, and the crowd was really, really rowdy. But the story that the late Andrew McNaughton, their photographer, told about how they were so mad when they got off stage, and Alex made, an inappropriate comment, but they all busted up laughing, and it kind of saved the mood. Because you don't hear tell of these guys storming off stage. They're just not that kind of band. And that's something that, was there more to that story, or was that the one time that they had that general admission gig, or was that a series of gigs?
God, I can't remember that. I mean, the only thing I could think of that is a similar thing is when Geddy gets whacked with a projectile from the crowd, and you hear that story all the time with these different bands, and that ticks people off. But I don't remember. I don't remember these guys ever having to stop a show because there's a fight in front. And I at least I don't know the stories about that. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there were other situations like that. Obviously, that whole thing, the Who stampede that killed, I think, 11 people in Cincinnati. That kind of put the end to those general admission shows, and that's why they were considered super dangerous, right? Because everybody would run in, they'd all cram right against the front, and people would pass out. They'd suffocate.
AC/DC too on the Razor's Edge was in Salt Lake City. There were three kids who were crushed. I think that was the same idea.
Wow.
And again, that stood out like the Ian Grandy story, because it's so rare. Because they had it, I think it was in their contract, and somebody obviously didn't read the contract. It's like the old David Lee Roth brown M&Ms. If they saw brown M&Ms to Dave, that meant somebody didn't read the contract. The other thing that was interesting, and I think they talked about it in that, was talking about motivations for keeping on, for doing another record, for doing another tour. That's something I never really thought of. But that's partially probably because I got on board. I became a fan in 87, so I would have been like 12, 13. And for me, it was like, yeah, guys, just keep putting out the records. But they'd already been going for quite a long time. And I never even occurred to me that by then they would have been thinking, do we really want to do this? And obviously that manifested itself in the gradual slowdown period. But did you ever get the impression from them? Because there's two parts in their history where there was real danger of them, closing up shop. Obviously, Neil's tragedies was a necessary, real stopper. And but the other one was late 80s when they were in between Hold Your Fire and Presto. Were there any other times that they talked about where they really kind of gave you the impression that, we might knock this on the head?
It's not specific times. I think it's more of like an intensifying feeling when these guys, because, I always talk about them. They're obviously like Renaissance men. They all have a lot of different interests in their lives, and uncommonly so. I mean, Neil and Geddy, especially, and Alex as well, well above the average in terms of, different things that they're into. Neil is the one that really all along the way, he could have knocked it on its head. And he was always the one that was a little bit, management's pushing for a tour this long and Neil wants it shortened and less of them, because he's into so many different things. So it was more of that along the way. And I think also, it must have rankled on them that the albums weren't really all that particularly well received every time out. They were selling less than they were when they were in their heyday. Just generally, Rush was a little less part of the pop culture fabric, and they're just getting bored of it because they are so intellectually curious and into wine and baseball and bicycling and motorcycling and flying and model planes and what
Golf.
else, collecting baseball stuff, going to baseball games, golf, having your own club, painting. So I think as things just got along, at any point, they're starting, like you say, in the late 80s, it started to become more and more a fight to get out on the road and stay on the road. And that's the other thing about Rush that's kind of interesting is that, as they proved throughout all the 90s and 2000s, other than, this big revelation of Rush in Rio kind of thing. And oh my God, how big are we here sort of thing. They're one of these bands that was not particularly a world band that were traveling everywhere like an Iron Maiden or a Deep Purple in our world, right? So they weren't playing all these exotic countries all the time. They were pretty insular. And in fact, for a Canadian band, they didn't really play all of Canada more than most big American bands did. Right.
Yeah, tell me about it.
You know that.
I'm
story.
out here in the East. I mean,
yeah,
they played, they famously, they started the Hold Your Fire tour out this way because of the protests from the previous tour where they didn't bring power windows here. So they played St. John's, they played Moncton. I wasn't going to concerts at that point, and they didn't come back here again until Clockwork Angels in 2013. I wasn't able to make that when they actually played in Halifax, which, by the way, is still an 8-hour drive for me. So they weren't like, they definitely weren't like, I don't know, the Hip or Sloan or some of these bands that just blanket cover the entire country. So it's, it's not like fans that aren't Canadian are thinking, well, you guys are spoiled up in Canada. You got to see them all the time. Not really the case. They really toured Canada like any American band would. You'd play Montreal and Toronto and Vancouver and maybe Halifax, but that'd be about it. Yeah. So now we move on to this album, Counterparts. Mm-hmm. And I was really interested in this period because this seems like it was sort of the apex of Geddy and Alex not fighting, but maybe just wearing on each other a little bit. They're very diplomatic about it, and they always say, they're best of friends or whatever, but it just seems like they were, I don't know if it was the keyboards or maybe that's just used as a scapegoat, but maybe there was just a lot of frustrations that came to the fore. And one of the, I think, wild cards they threw into that was Kevin Shirley. He strikes me as a very outspoken guy. And what was your impression about the whole Counterparts period? Just not only as a fan, but talking to them about the making of that record.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Kevin comes into the fray. He hasn't really done much yet. He's not the famous Kevin Shirley yet, really. I mean, he would make his bread or his his fame with Iron Maiden, more or less, right? among other things, but he comes into it as not particularly a huge Rush fan. And he's just a little bit more like looking around saying, well, there's got to be enough bass and treble on this. There's got to be some guitars on this. That's what you guys did, isn't it? Isn't that what you used to do? So it's funny that this is not particularly a Peter Collins production. It doesn't sound like Hold Your Fire or Power Windows, right? So he's kind of out of character in this, and everybody almost gives it the Kevin Shirley stamp more than anything else. But I think the album's a little overrated or over narrated as really heavy or like a real return to Rush, because there's still a lot of Alex massaging in a lot of acoustic guitar, and Geddy sings pretty kind of conservative and mellow and, you know, melancholy even on the record. He's not gone back to the old days. But I think because we got Stick It Out as an advanced single, which is just bald-faced, completely heavy, as an advanced single. So that's what everybody focused on for however long that was, a couple months, 6 weeks or whatever it was. And then you got Animate. So Animate came in, and you got that great big drum intro and a very filled in sound, like the entire sonic spectrum filled in. So the two most prominent songs on the album are pretty heavy. But the rest of the album, you know, has some pretty heavy stuff too. But the good thing about it, and the amazing thing, even though in the Rush canon, when it came out at the time, it wasn't particularly greater received than the previous few. But I think it really does succeed in that thing of having a set of production values and a sound palette that doesn't annoy you, which I think, you know, the previous good 4 albums had kind of an annoying production sound on them. So this is a good sounding record. But I don't think the songwriting is completely different from the previous two, from the 2 Rupert Hinde ones. You know, a lot, except for, again, those first 2 songs are really quite heavy.
Yeah, Stick It Out was, I remember being, you know, very surprised when that first came out. It's funny because, you know, Rush have been a favorite of mine for a long, long time, and I really don't think that there's much for duds. And admittedly, I mean, like I said, I got into the band in '87, and that was when they were in the midst of, you know, Hold Your Fire. Hold Your Fire was pretty much out. Presto was the first album that I remember awaiting for a long period of time as a new fan. But getting into all the old stuff and just embracing it sort of as a whole. Mm-hmm. I remember being a little underwhelmed by Counterparts, and I don't know why. I've never really gotten on board. And I'll tell you, one of the things that kind of got me out of that was joining in, as you have, on the Rush fans roundtables, because Counterparts gets a lot of love there. And so I thought, you know what, I'm gonna nail this record into me and really get it down pat. And it has grown on me. I think stuff like Cut to the Chase and Double Agent are quite good. But I will say this, I still think The Speed of Love is possibly the most boring Rush song. That song does nothing for me. And when I hear Neil talk about how hard he worked on the drum parts, I'm like, why? It's a boring song. Yeah. It's sung boring, it's written boring, the title is boring. But you know, you can't get it right every time. But what was, you know, as someone who grew up with the band, and I mean, you know, so you got into them in '75, you've said many times. So you were kind of on, not ground zero, but pretty close to it. And someone that's written a lot of books and read a lot of articles. What were some things that you found out in doing all of these interviews and putting these together that surprised you, that you didn't know about, or you didn't know it was to the degree that it was?
Well, you know, one thing that I found quite interesting and helped me like Test for Echo more, because I was not big into the band at that time, was that whole that whole idea of massaging in the acoustic guitar with the heavy stuff, which they picked up on later. I mean, you don't get a lot of that on Vapor Trails, but you definitely get a lot of that on I would say on Snakes and Arrows, right? You do get a lot of that the tracking of the acoustic with the electric. What else? Boy, I was have a trouble sort of thinking about that one. That was surprising. You know, it did make me appreciate albums more and appreciate certain albums less. That the whole narrative about the production of Grace Under Pressure was kind of a bummer on the whole thing, and also hearing how freezing cold it was the whole time they were recording that album. Like, it just sounded like that album was a crushing amount of work. I think it still sounds good. It's a good album. I love kind of the darkness of the whole thing. It's a very sort of serious album. And it looks a lot like the album cover. But yeah, man, they've been through so many different phases, and I just think back to even the first time I was ticked off at Rush, which was Farewell to Kings. You know, I remember getting that album home and thinking, this isn't heavy enough. You know, it's certainly not 2112, right?
Yeah.
So and then you're on board, and then you're not on board. I remember the Power Windows time clearly. Being kind of excited about the technology during that time, hearing Big Money for the first time, which I believe probably was an advanced single as well at the time.
That's the first song I ever heard by them, actually.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, going along thinking, I can be on board for this album. And I remember feeling somewhat the excitement of it and going on that trip along technology with them a little bit. Right, not loving the album, but liking it enough, and then kind of rejecting the next one. I was not a Hold Your Fire fan, but yeah, it's amazing the phases they've gone through, and so Test for Echo, I got a little more appreciation for it, but still, that was a time in my life that it didn't seem like the right music that I was really into. You know, they were not at any sort of cutting edge. It didn't sound like an album to me that really particularly needed to be done, like needed to come out of them, and it just felt like we had to do an album because it was time, sort of thing. I don't know. I don't know how fair that is, but yeah, it just, I think that's kind of a low point of this whole last part of the trilogy thing.
It's interesting because I love Test for Echo. I think it's way better than Counterparts myself. But I think one of the things, oh, by the way, I never noticed this till I read it in the book. I look at the vinyl that you got the little guys on there.
Yeah,
you really lose that with, I mean, you lose it with CDs.
Yeah,
you lost it with tapes, and you definitely use it with digital. But if I recall correctly, I was just in a store. I didn't even know they had an album coming out. It had been quite a long time. Mm-hmm. I didn't pick up, but to this day, I still don't own Victor. I don't own Alex's album. I'm not a particular fan of the vocals. And I may get it eventually. I don't know. But so I wasn't really thinking we're going to get a new Rush album this year, because that had come out earlier in that year. So I saw it, there it was in the racks, and I was so taken by it that maybe I was just ready to hear it. I don't know, but I've always had a soft spot for that one. And then, of course, how difficult was it to talk about Neil's tragedies? I mean, like, to me, like the best way to read this book is to read until that point, put this down, read Neil's Ghost Rider book, and then pick this up again. Yeah. But how was that talking to, I assume you talked to Neil about it, but like even talking to the other guys about it, like Alex and Geddy and even Ray?
Yeah, it's the way I approached that, and then Neil's death as well, was I just tried to, because Sam and Scott got so much good stuff out of Neil on that, I mean, Neil just kind of opened up, and there's a lot of Neil in that whole period through there, and talking to the other guys about it. I figured that there was really no reason for me to intrude too much into this, into this respectful space that seemed to be covered well enough by Neil and Geddy and Alex, because there's quite a lot in there at that point leading up to Vapor Trails. And then when I had to, because I had this written so long ago, this book had been finished long before Neil died. We had to go and make the changes after he died, because it was just going to press, sort of thing, at that point. And at that point, I had known some things about, what was going on at the end there. It was a surprise when he died, but I decided to leave that pretty short, and again leave myself out of it. And I believe I had to make an adjustment in the introduction. So I really just kind of made some changes at the beginning and made some changes at the end, and decided there's no way I'm going to go through the whole book and speak the whole book as if he is now gone, sort of thing. So we left all the middle and just kind of came up with that very, painful stuff to talk about at the very end. But no, I think see, that's the thing about Neil with that I've always found amusing is over the years, I mean, in the beginning, he was in there like a dirty shirt talking to everybody, just like the rest of the guys. But later on, he removed himself, and it was more, Getty and Alex, who were the spokesman for the records as time went on, right? But what Neil did is he went on his own accord and said, I'm going to do this interview process my own way, and I'm just going to tell everybody everything they need to know in a book, so nobody needs to ask me this stuff again. And it felt that way also, in the way he interacted with Sam and Scott when they would go visit him and stuff, and they it seemed like he if he's put in the place to do interviews, he's going to do it right, the way he does everything right. And he just opens up, and he's really smart, and he's really, emotionally there and connected to the conversation. And he was like that with me as well. When we did the original book, I got a good long hotel room interview with him because, it was an official book and we were all going to, and he was the same way. He just patiently kind of went through everything with me. So that was cool. So yeah, I guess, to recap, it's covered so well by all three of those guys and Ray and other people that there was no point me being in there too.
Yeah, and the thing about Neil, and this is where I made a note to ask you about this too, about if you ask Neil a question in 1985, and then you ask him the same question in 1995, and then in 2005, he's pretty much going to tell you the same thing. He's got his opinion on how he viewed it, and that's it. But I've noticed that Getty and Alex, and that's one thing I like about how you present it in the books, and I really noticed it in the first time I noticed you doing that was in your Whitesnake book, how the quote from, say, David Coverdale when an album is released, as opposed to talking about that same album 20 years later, could be way, way different. And Getty and Alex seem to, there's certain narratives that always come up, signals, the keyboards coming in and taking up all the guitar frequencies. But there are certain things that I notice that they've changed their answers to, or they've either softened on or they've gotten more determined on. But with Neil, it's kind of always been, he said it and he means it. And that's his answer. Mm-hmm. And you also raised a good point about Neil's books. He went from being the most, say, press shy member of the band to undercutting all traditional media outlets and putting it all out in his books. I've only got 3 of his books, but they're compelling reads, and you really do feel like he was right there talking to you, especially Ghost Rider, which is such an emotional read with, it's just like a good album. It's got all these peaks and valleys and ends on a really good note. Let's see, what else? Yeah, contrast between quotes at the time and then beyond. Like, what was there something that you noticed that they were telling you about a particular album that you're thinking back and going, that's not what they said when it first came out?
I think Presto strikes me as one like that with Alex in particular. I think he's down on it now, and at the time he was probably a little more enthusiastic about it. You're always enthusiastic about the time, but I do find it funny how Getty seems to still be pretty steadfast on all those years, thinking what they were doing at that time is or was valid and is still very valid. Possibly because one of the narratives about them is that these albums are all about singing and vocal melodies. And then the other thing is Neil as well. I think he stuck by, as you say, he stuck by most of his opinions of all that experimenting with the electronic drums and feeling that it was valid. As he moves away, he does get a little more perspective and he sees the wide course of rock history and where these things fit in there. But Yeah, I think Alex is probably, which is true to his personality, I guess, is the guy who will shoot from the hip a little more, and realize that certain things were mistakes along the way. But it's funny if you admit whole albums are mistakes sometimes, and Rush kind of almost gets there. What does that say about how good your creative instincts are, right? You mentioned Speed of Love, and it's like, okay, a song here or there, that's one thing, but when you might say a whole record was an experiment that maybe it didn't work too well, it's like, wow, that's not so good.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. It's like I just, I spent $12.99 on a mistake and
Yeah.
convinced myself it was good. Yeah, it's interesting because they do it, and it took a long, long time. I think it was around the time of Clockwork Angels that Getty did an interview with, I think it was for Classic Rock Magazine in the UK. And he talked to Ty Shan. Ty Shan's the whipping boy, right? For like worst Rush song. And the way he said it, he said, just kind of felt like an error. And I just thought that was so funny that, wow, because I always figured that, they've never phoned in an album, but it doesn't always make for the most compelling of listening experiences. And even though, like, Hold Your Fire and Presto, I listened to those albums a lot. They were the albums that were current when I first got into the band. It is very true, the way that you described it. It sounds like they're playing in a matchbox. Like, it's not particularly, never mind hard rock, some of it's not even particularly rock. And even, the songs that you do like, you just wish you could go in there with the faders and beef up the guitars a little more and get a different snare sound that doesn't sound quite so, I don't know. One thing that I didn't know about from reading the book before they settled on Nick Raskulinecz, who I think did a great job with Snakes and Arrows and Clockwork Angels, but the idea of them working with Bob Rock sounded interesting to me. Like, what do you think a Bob Rock produced Rush album would sound like? Would it have that big, Tommy Lee, Lars Ulrich snare, or how would those parties have worked together?
That would be amazing. I mean, probably Bob Rock would do exactly what Nick did with them, but Bob Rock would probably be able to get more of his way. I would imagine, being a little bit more of a big shot, right? And being a Canadian, maybe, right? So it's, Nick somewhat got his way. I think he gave them some of their groove back and some of the bottom end back. And it was all a little more spontaneous, but Rush is still kind of writing like Rush. And I wonder if Bob Rock might have even got them to steer their writing a little more. So that would have been really cool. And just another point I wanted to touch on that you were mentioning there. I've often thought it would be pretty amazing to, I've thought across all the way, the whole, I would say, Power Windows through Let's Stop at Counterparts. But there's a bunch of songs there that exactly as you said. I mean, if you could go in and re-record certain of these Rush songs with a complete set of heavy metal tools, there could be some pretty amazing, raging, pretty cool songs there, because there are some dark melodies and some atonal things and some dark lyrical subjects that were rendered in this matchbox fashion. That had they not been, had you given it a recording like you got on, say, I would say the heaviest recording that Rush ever got is probably the heavy stuff on 2112. So if you would have recorded, gone on, get the Rush panels on this, right? Picking out the songs and do a like a what is that called? A like almost like a wish list thing of say these 11 songs, and pick out 11 songs and say, and actually give them to a Rush tribute band, right? And say, go away and record these like say, what would be a good example of just a good, well-rounded heavy metal recording? And I'm not even thinking Rush, but well, yeah, I mean, maybe like Metallica Black Album, something like that. Most other Metallica productions are too radical to say, but that's not a radical production, but that would be like, just record it like that. Redo these songs, record it like that, push some air into those Getty vocals. And I would love to hear a Rush tribute band take 11 of those songs from that era and do them heavy metal style and see what they came out like.
Yeah, because even when they had a rockin' song like Dreamline, I don't know why they felt compelled to do it, because the whole narrative was they were getting away from keyboards, but it comes in, you get that dan, dan, dan. Like, why do you need those bleeding keyboards there? You know, da, 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 do it with a guitar. Yeah, you're right. And it's funny because I can't think of the name of them, but there is a group, and I think they're actually a Kiss tribute group that has done versions of songs like Secretly Cruel from Asylum, but they did it, and you listen to it and it sounds like it came off of Dress to Kill. So that's basically the same idea. Yeah, it would be really cool to hear, you know, stuff like Show Don't Tell, or like I said, Dreamline. You know, some of the stuff you wouldn't have to do much to, but, and I'm not even saying get rid of the keyboards altogether, but just don't have them so much louder than the guitar, and have the drums have that be that bottom end. And I think you're right about like the Bob Rock Black Album production. Make it something that's that goes down easy to most people. They don't really have to struggle to listen through the mix to get to the song, which, you know, yeah, like you said, a lot of Metallica productions are like that. Certainly, And Justice for All is not easy listening metal, but the Black Album, you know, the edges are smoothed off, and that's probably what a Bob Rock produced Metallica album would sound like, which is interesting because never, you know, back in the late 80s, early 90s, I never would have dreamed that would have even, his name would have even come up on the list, because, you know, Bob Rock, Bruce Fairbairn, that was the more commercial leaning bands. And I've certainly got a lot of those albums in my collection those guys have produced, but I never ever thought Rush would be one of them. Having said that, and I know he's no longer with us, but I never thought Rupert Hine was a good choice to produce not only Rush, but any rock band. You know what I mean? Like, his production style was perfect for The Fix, but not so much for Rush. And I find it interesting that not only did they work with him on 2 albums, but they wanted to work with him on Grace Under Pressure. And you have to wonder what would have happened if they'd have worked with, I don't know who else they could have worked with at that time that could have made those songs come alive more than they did.
Chris Tangerides, Martin Birch, Max Norman. There's all sorts of Bo Hill.
Yeah.
You know,
that's true. Yeah, get one of the new wave of British heavy metal producer guys to work with him. Yeah. I really didn't have anything else, Martin. It's a great book, and it really, you know, I remember thinking when this came out, because there aren't as many albums to talk about, and I remember thinking that even though there's not a lot of albums, there's an awful lot more life that happened to those guys. And, you know, it's pretty remarkable that we got a whole second act with Rush that we might not have gotten as fans, you know. 3 really good albums, you know, the covers EP, a bunch of live stuff, and a much more visible band. Beyond the Lighted Stage was, you know, I think that turned a lot of people's opinions around about this band, that, oh yeah, those guys have been around a long time. And not only that, but then the follow-up one, the Time Stands Still, I thought that was a really excellent one too, about the winding down process. And now when I watch that, it takes on so much more gravity because of, you know, because of Neil's passing. I mean, I can remember distinctly, I'll never forget it. I mean, I work in radio, and so I do, you know, weekend shows, but you do them, you know, a couple of days in advance. And I'd already done my Saturday night, and I remember I was getting ready to go home, and my wife had to run into the store, and she came back out, and I'm not much of a poker face. I had just been, you know, on my phone, and all of a sudden I saw that Rolling Stone article that everybody else saw. And she took one look at me and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "We got to go back to the station. I got to change a couple of voice tracks. There's no way I can't talk about this." And that was one of the, because, you know, with Neil and Eddie Van Halen, those both hit pretty hard as far as, you know, for guys I've never met in my life, but just music that I've lived with for so long. Eddie wasn't that much of a surprise. You knew he'd had some form of cancer. You kind of got the idea that he'd beaten it, but at the same time, it was kind of in the back of your mind. And true to his nature, Neil had no idea. Like, it was totally out of the blue. Like, that was, you know, and just seemed like all he wanted was to have that little bit of time home. And, you know, you'd like to think he got some good years in before it got too bad, I guess. But, you know, that's a, that's all, we'll never know, right? But like you said, like even not just his books, but even when he used to do his stories on his website, I always enjoyed reading those, his monthly things. But that's really about it. I wondered how much could fill up a book that didn't have a lot of albums. And then, the more I read about it, like, yeah, these guys had a lot happen to them in between those albums, instead of putting up the one, sometimes two albums a year and being on that treadmill. This time around, it's like they had more time and more life happen to them in that time.
Yeah.
So it's a great book. All three of them. If somebody out there gets one, you're going to want all three. MartinPopoff.com is where to get them. I'll give you the floor now, Martin. What have you got going on? You've always got a million things going on, but what's the most recent thing you're working on?
Well, just newer than, well, around the same age as Driven, which is pretty recent. There is the Angel book. There's the Sweet book. There's the Flaming Telepaths, Imaginos Expanded and Specified, where I drew 39 illustrations in there, and I've actually got a little print offer in the back of that. That's kind of a fun, very strange book. But I've got the Uriah Heep coffee table book coming soon in that series from Weimer, where we did a Van Halen and a who else did we do? Bloister Cult, Thin Lizzy so far. There'll be a Nazareth one of those as well. That's about it for the near future. So yeah, all of that MartinPopoff.com, except not the Heap or the Nazareth yet, but Driven, Sweet, Angel are the most recent ones in the Imaginos book.
And you've got your podcast, History and Songs with Martin Popoff. That's always a lot of fun.
History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff. We're up to 95 episodes of that. We've got the Contrarians, which you've done an awesome job on. You've been on that, and I hear you've got another one coming soon. That's really cool to hear. So yeah, you've been a good guest on Contrarians. We've got that, which is 2 different shows. The one where you have a contrarian pick for your favorite album, and the other one we do this worst album series, and we've done a few other things, and there's some good Patreon exclusive stuff there as well. So yeah, just keep it on doing the podcast and writing these books.
Cool. Well, Martin, thank you very much for taking time out. I know you're doing a ton of press right now. Thanks to everybody for watching, and check out, if you don't have any of Martin's books, check out MartinPopoff.com. Do yourself a favor. He'll sign them to you. He might even throw in some bookmarks. Yeah. So thanks everybody for watching Tim's Vinyl Confessions.